Hi, my name is Angie Bouma. I'm the Senior Land Steward at the Grand Traverse Regional Land Conservancy. Today I'm at the Misty Acres Borwell Preserve in a mesic northern forest to talk about ferns. They've found fossil evidence of ferns that exist today that are virtually unchanged from 180 million years ago. So ferns are an incredibly ancient and interesting group of plants to learn. So today I'm going to go over some high-level identification tips and a few species of note here at Misty Acres. So at Misty Acres, there are 39 documented fern species growing here. And today we're looking at a species that is pretty common throughout our service area called ostrich fern. And this distinctive and well-known fern is able to grow in a variety of habitats, but it prefers wetland soils. This forest here is remarkable for its rich soils and seasonal flooding that occurs in the ravines, and we're near the Betsy River. So the combination of rich soils, shade, and the water presence is enough to have a great diversity of ferns in one area. So ostrich fern tends to grow in a vase-like structure. When you're first getting into fern identification, it's good to look at the shape of the fern overall. Ostrich fern is named for the shape of the fern fronds that are shaped like ostrich feathers. So that's how it gets its common name. And you can see here it's growing in like a circular vase shape. It is connected by rhizomes from one plant to another, but it does grow in these distinctive clumps. So when you're first learning about ferns, learning about their growth form is an important first step. So now that we've talked about the forms of the ferns, we're going to talk about the shape of the leaves, which is the next level of fern identification. So in fern terminology, the green part that you see here is called the frond. And at first glance, ostrich fern and glade fern look very similar. However, when you zero in on the fronds itself, you can see some differences, and in fern terminology and in other plant identification terminology, how many times the leaf is divided is a helpful identification tool, and often you'll run into that if you're keying this out through an actual fern identification book. So what they mean by once divided in fern terminology, the glade fern is a good example of a pinna or leaflet that is once divided, and ostrich fern is a good example of a fern that is twice divided. And when we get over into wood fern identification, those leaflets or pinnae are 3 times divided. So the other factor in fern identification that is useful to know is the shape of the sori, which are the structures that hold the spores for the fertile fronds of the fern species. So each fern species has its own shape of their sori that is useful for identification and very critical to identifying ferns down to the species level. The thing that makes ferns unique in the plant world or plant kingdom is their reproductive methodology or life cycle, where they reproduce by spores instead of seeds. And this means that each fern species has spores that need to travel from one plant to another in order to reproduce. And how ferns do that is unique depending on the species that you're looking at. And each fern has millions of spores. They're microscopic. They are not visible to the human eye, but the sacs or sori that hold the spores are visible, and those are useful for identification, like I mentioned earlier. They call a fern that is reproducing and has sori visible is a fertile frond, and we have 2 examples here, again, ostrich fern and glade fern, showing some of the different ways that ferns produce those sori. On glade fern, which is the species here, The sori are underneath the leaflets or the pinnae, and not every frond of glade fern will have the sori on it, only the fertile fronds. But they are almost identical to the sterile fronds right next to it. On the other hand, ostrich fern has a very distinctive and separate fertile frond. Cinnamon fern is another one that also has this. But ostrich fern will have a stalk growing right out the middle, which is the leaf blades that are holding the sori, and they're very reduced leaf blades, so they look like woody stalks or stems, and they persist all year. Right now, these are the actively growing fertile fronds for ostrich fern, and over here you can see last year's stalks. So even in the winter, you'd be able to find ostrich fern growing. And these two different types of growth forms are a good way to highlight the examples of sori and how you would need to know that terminology in order to identify a fern to species. So the microtopography at Misty Acres is really conducive to fern diversity and species richness. There's over 200 plants found on this property and over 39 species of ferns and fern allies. And one of the more well-known or popular native ferns of Michigan is the maidenhair fern, and just a really unique spiral structure to the fronds. And then underneath the pinnae are the indusium, so these are right at the edge of the leaf margins, and they just look like little lines. But those all hold the microscopic spores. There's a lot to learn about fern identification. The more you know, the more enjoyable it is. And Misty Acres is a great place to see fern diversity in northern lower Michigan, as well as many other conservancy protected natural areas and nature preserves.